Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attain everlasting life. Amen. Introduction of guests. I recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask for leave for an extended introduction.
Premier's asked for leave for an extended introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to members of this Assembly. I have a few introductions that I will get through here, Mr. Speaker, but it is my pleasure to introduce to you and through you to all members of this Legislative Assembly. With us today, Mr. Speaker, is Mr. Cassie Rowe, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Indian Business Council. Mr. Rowe is accompanied today by Jody Banks, the Acting Deputy Minister of Trade and Export Development. Mr. Speaker, I had the opportunity to sit down with him earlier today, and we had a great discussion on a range of issues. And there are few people in Canada better informed about India, Mr. Speaker, than Mr. Rowe. Mr. Rowe is a consultant and an advisor to corporations, to governments, to universities, as well as to nonprofit organizations. And for many years, he has served as a Vice President and Director for the Asia Pacific Foundation in Toronto. And Mr. Speaker, Mr. Rowe is very familiar with Saskatchewan, and he's a good friend to our province of Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, there can be no doubt that deepening engagement with Asia in general and with India in particular must be a priority for our province. India is one of the fastest growing nations in the world, and today it is Saskatchewan's third largest export market. Last year alone, we shipped more than $1.1 billion worth of goods to the nation of India. That total included more than $700 million worth of pulse crops. Saskatchewan is India's largest supplier of both lentils and peas. Our potash shipments to India have risen by nearly 50% last year compared to the year before, and of course Cameco continues to ship Saskatchewan uranium to India. But we have much more than that. There are 20 educational agreements that are in place, and more people from India are calling this province home. In the last decade, we've welcomed nearly 15,000 newcomers to the province of Saskatchewan from the nation of India. And those folks I would put forward are making our province and our communities stronger through the businesses that they operate, the families that they are raising, and through the culture and language that they share with us. Mr. Speaker, I'm optimistic that our partnership with India will only get stronger as the years go by. I'm grateful for the advice and the guidance provided by Mr. Rowe, among a host of others, as we work to strengthen that partnership to make that synergistic relationship even stronger. Mr. Speaker, I would ask all members to join me in welcoming Mr. Cassie Rowe to the Assembly here today. Mr. Speaker, while I'm on my feet, it brings me great pleasure to introduce some very important guests who are visiting our Saskatchewan Assembly here today. With us are representatives from the Executive Committee of the Pacific Northwest Economic Region Organization, or better known as PNWER. Members of the delegation include, and I'd ask you to give a wave as I mention your name, Senator Arnie Roblin, an Oregon State Senator and the current President of PNWER. Matt Morrison, the Chief Executive Officer of PNWER. Mike Cuff, a Montana State Representative and the Vice President of PNWER. Shauna Argue, this is Saskatchewan's private sector representative to PNWER, and she is also the Director of Registration with the Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists here in Saskatchewan. And Brandon Hardenbrook, PNWER's Deputy Director and Chief Operating Officer. Mr. Speaker, PNWER is a public-private partnership of governments, businesses, and non-government organizations from the Northwest region of our continent of North America. Mr. Speaker, this is a diverse membership with a common cause: to promote growth, to promote competitiveness through regional collaboration and the reduction of trade and regulatory barriers. Mr. Speaker, our guests have a busy program while they visit Regina here. They will meet with the Lieutenant Governor, a number of cabinet ministers with representatives from Saskatchewan's Trade and Export Partnership, and I look forward to meeting with our guests later this afternoon. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan has been an active and engaged member of PNWER. The Minister of Agriculture served as their president in 2012, 2013, and in this July, the member for Cut Knife Turtleford, the current Vice President of PNWER, will take over as president, and we know he will do a terrific job in that role. Mr. Speaker, Penware makes a significant contribution to the strong and enduring partnership of our two great nations. And I would ask all members of this Assembly to join me in welcoming our guests to the legislature here today. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Speaker, I would like to introduce to you and through you to all members of the Assembly, three and a half people actually. Richard Billington, Susan Billington, Courtney Billington, Mr. Speaker, and little baby Billington that will be with us here in July. Mr. Speaker, both Richard and Susan have been lawyers in Calgary for about 30 years, and they have a long-standing passion for federal and provincial politics and all things good for Western Canada and our nation. Mr. Speaker, they have a special tie to this legislature, as their son is my Director of Comms, Jim Billington, Mr. Speaker, and I hear they've resigned themselves to the fact that Jim will forever be a Saskatchewan Roughriders fan, not a Calgary Stampeders fan, as it goes through the next generation as well, Mr. Speaker. And Courtney has called Saskatchewan home for the last 3 years. Courtney also is very special, has a special connection to the legislature, as Jim proposed to her in the Rotunda just before Christmas in 2015, Mr. Speaker. And they obviously weren't quite busy enough in the most recent leadership race, Mr. Speaker, as they'll be expecting their young daughter here in July, adding to the population of our great province, Mr. Speaker. So I ask all members to welcome Richard, Susan, and Courtney Billington to the Saskatchewan legislature.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave for extended introduction.
The member has requested leave for an extended introduction. Is leave granted? Recognize the member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my pleasure today to join with the Premier in welcoming a number of special guests to your gallery. First of all, I'd like to welcome Mr. Cassie Rowe, the CEO of the Canada-India Business Council, and welcome you and on behalf of the official opposition and all members here today. I think it's very important that we acknowledge and celebrate the very important friendship and the very important trade relationship that takes place between India and our province, and welcome you here today and thank you for your expertise and your work in extending that friendship and that relationship. I would also like to join with the Premier in welcoming some guests from Penwar to our Legislative Assembly. The member from Regina Rosemont and I had an opportunity to meet briefly with this group and have a little time over lunch and really welcome the conversation and the relationships that were built there, and I'm sure that will only continue to grow. With us, as has been mentioned, Senator Roblen from Oregon, Mr. Morrison from Penwar, Representative Cuff, and Shauna Argue, as has been mentioned, with APEGS, and the private sector representative, former Senator Brendan, and Mr. Hardenbrook, Deputy Director and Chief Operating Officer with Penwar. Of course, accompanying them today, Ms. Carter and Ms. Harder. I know that there's an exciting summit coming up soon in Seattle, which the member from Saskatoon Fairview is delighted to be able to attend. And next year, to all members, we are looking forward to the summit coming here to Saskatoon, and really looking forward to this continued relationship, this opportunity to meet together and to deepen our knowledge, best practices around issues that face all jurisdictions in the Pacific Northwest, and really welcome the opportunity to meet with you today and look forward to an ongoing relationship. I invite all members to join me in welcoming these guests to their assembly.
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, in my brief comments at the outset, I was remiss, and I missed one of our guests, Mr. Speaker, one of our individuals, one of our former senators from the state of Montana that's been involved with Penware and been involved with trade relations and a relationship among, nation to nation, if you will, and state to province. Mr. Speaker, and that's former Senator Mr. John Brennan from the state of Montana, Mr. Speaker, and I apologize for not having you in my opening comments. And I want to thank all of those within Penwar, Mr. Speaker, for the effort and initiative on both sides of the border to continue with the great relationship that Saskatchewan and Canada have with states across the United States and the United States itself. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you to this Assembly, it's my pleasure to introduce some guests in your gallery, Mr. Speaker. Representatives from the Saskatchewan Dietitians Association, the Dietitians of Canada, and the University of Saskatchewan's Nutrition Program. We have with us, and ask them to each give a wave as I introduce you, Lana Moore, who's Registrar with the Saskatchewan Dietitians Association, Jennifer Wojcik, Regional Executive Director with Dietitians of Canada, and Jessica Liefers, Assistant Professor with the College of Pharmacy and Nutrition. Mr. Speaker, they will be meeting later this afternoon with the Minister of Rural and Remote Health and myself, and they're also hosting a reception at 5 o'clock today for members on both sides of the Assembly. We thank them for that. Look forward to seeing them there. Mr. Speaker, I would ask all members to please give them a warm welcome to their Assembly.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to join briefly with the Minister in welcoming these guests to their Assembly today, the delegation of dietitians, and certainly look forward to the reception this evening. I know we'll all be paying close attention to the fare that's spread out before us. I'm sure that it will be perfectly balanced and beneficial to all of us. I do welcome each of you on behalf of the official opposition and all members to your Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the member for Martensville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, it's an honor today to introduce 32 grade 8 students from Venture Heights School in Martensville. They are accompanied by their teacher Tanya Robertson and Karen Height, and chaperones Michelle Leach, Joelle Ward, Del Lenny, and Dawn Giesbrecht. It's been, I think, probably at least 2 years since I've had a school group, so I'm pretty excited about meeting with them after question period, and I would ask all my colleagues to welcome them to their Legislative Assembly.
Recognize a member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to welcome a group of 17 students from grade 8 school, Riverside School in Prince Albert. Mr. Speaker, it's not very often that we get a group from Prince Albert, and this is my very first school group, so I'm pretty excited to meet up with them too and get to find out all the questions that they have. I've had the opportunity to go to Riverside School a few times, and those students always have the best questions and are really prepared, and their teachers do a great job talking to them about government and our roles. They're also accompanied by their teachers, Jordan Holman and Tanya Van Kootenet. So I'm looking forward to spending some time with the teachers and the students this afternoon, and I ask that all members welcome them to their legislature.
Presenting petitions. Ooh. Recognize the member for Cumberland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to present a petition in support of mental health and addiction services in the North. Here. Northern Saskatchewan has some of the highest suicide rates in the country. The Children's Advocate has put out a report stating the lack of services in the North. The suicide rate is 6 times higher for First Nation boys than non-First Nation boys between the age of 10 and 19. And 26 times higher for First Nation girls than non-First Nation girls. I will read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the Sask Party government to treat Northern Saskatchewan residents with respect and dignity, and to immediately invest in more mental health and wellness programs and facilities in the North. It is signed and supported by many good people of the province. I so present. Here.
There's a member for Moose Jaw Wakama.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to rise today to present a petition from citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose a carbon tax on the province of Saskatchewan. I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action. To cause the government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by the good citizens of Moose Jaw. I do so present.
As the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition to get big money out of Saskatchewan politics. And the undersigned residents of the province of Saskatchewan want to bring to our attention the following: that Saskatchewan's outdated Election Act allows corporations, unions, and individuals, even those outside the province, to make unlimited donations to our province's political parties. That the people of Saskatchewan deserve to live in a fair province where all voices are equal and money can't influence politics. And we know, Mr. Speaker, that over the past 10 years, the Saskatchewan Party has received $12.61 million in corporate donations, and of that, $2.87 million come from companies outside Saskatchewan. Wow. You know, Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan politics should belong to Saskatchewan people, and we know that the federal government and the provinces of Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and now British Columbia have moved to limit this influence and level the playing field by banning corporate and union donations to political parties. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows: respectfully request that the Government of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party to overhaul Saskatchewan campaign finance laws, to end out-of-province donations, to put a ban on donations from corporations and unions, and to put a donation limit on individual donations. Mr. Speaker, the people signing this petition come from the city of Regina. I do so present. Thank you.
And as a member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition calling for critical workplace supports for survivors of domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan has the dubious distinction of having the highest rates of intimate partner violence amongst all of the provinces, and we know that we must do much more to protect those who experience domestic violence. For many, the violence will follow them to their workplace. That's why the signatories to this petition are calling for 5 days of paid leave and up to 17 weeks of unpaid leave be made available to workers who are survivors of domestic violence, and that critical workplace supports made available to survivors of domestic violence should also be made available to workers living with post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of that intimate partner violence. Mr. Speaker, this is what those who are on the front lines of this crisis are calling for. PATHS is one organization that has specifically called for this, as well as the YWCA of Regina. The impact to businesses is minimal financially, Mr. Speaker, and this is what we've called for in our private member bill number 609, the fourth time we've put forward that provision in this House in the last 2 years. It's time for the government to step up and pass that private member's bill. I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows: respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the Sask Party government to pass legislation to ensure critical supports in the workplace, including reasonable accommodation and paid and unpaid leave for survivors of domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, the individuals signing this petition today come from Regina. I do so present.
Looking as a member for Athabasca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I present a petition around Orkambi, whereas Orkambi is the first drug to treat the basic defect in the largest population of Canadians with cystic fibrosis. It can slow the disease progression, allowing patients to live longer, healthier lives. The prayer reads as follows, Mr. Speaker. Respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan urge the Ministry of Health to negotiate a fair price for Orkambi and to make it available to the Saskatchewan Drug Plan for those who meet the conditions set by Health Canada and the clinical criteria established by Canadian CF clinicians. Now, Mr. Speaker, the people that have signed the many pages of petition that I presented over the last couple of years have been all throughout Saskatchewan and throughout Canada. And on the page that I'm presenting today, they are primarily from St. Brew, Lloydminster, and Nacum. I so present.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, this past weekend, together with my family, I was honored to attend the 3rd annual Sick Day Parade here in the Queen City, along with the Leader of the Official Opposition, members from Regina Elphinstone Centre, Douglas Park, Lakeview, yourself as Speaker, and members from the opposite side as well. Saturday's parade was filled with bright color and sharing of culture and faith. The parade is part of the Harvest Festival known as Vaseki. After an opening prayer at the temple, the crowd of hundreds began to walk towards the legislature, where thousands more joined together in celebration. Mr. Speaker, the parade is an opportunity to come together, but also to educate people about Sikhism. Several activities were open to the public, including free food, I quote, served in the spirit of love, compassion, and selfless service, and Gatka, which is a form of martial arts. Mr. Speaker, I've learned that love is the main message of Sikhism, to love everybody, to help everybody, give generously, and live together peacefully. I was pleased to once again share in this powerful expression of the strength offered by our diversity and proudly putting our provincial model from many people's strength on full display. I ask all members to join with me in recognizing and thanking the organizers of this great day, all those that made it such a great success.
Hear, hear.
Recognize the member for Estevan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to acknowledge May 14th to the 18th as Sexual Assault Awareness Week here in the province. Sexual assault is a horrific act, and its effects are widespread. Our government takes this issue very seriously and has been investing in supports for those who have been victimized. Just recently, our government launched the Listen Project in partnership with the Public Legal Education Association. The Listen Project provides 2 hours of free legal advice to survivors of sexual violence, with an additional 2 hours depending on the circumstances. There will be an important direct support for victims of sexual assault. Mr. Speaker, our government also provides an additional $1.2 million annually to 7 sexual assault service programs across Saskatchewan. These include centres in the Battlefords, Lloydminster, Regina, Saskatoon, Yorkton, and Prince Albert. These centres provide services including 24-hour crisis telephone lines, support, and accompanying individuals to medical, legal, and social service appointments, and providing information, referrals, and public education. Mr. Speaker, sexual assault is a problem, and we need to continue to bring awareness to it. While our government continues to take this issue very seriously, there is more work to be done. Mr. Speaker, I ask that all members of this Assembly join me in acknowledging Sexual Assault Awareness Week. Thank you.
I recognize the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Wednesday, May 2nd, Prince Albert North Search and Rescue Organization held a vigil in honor of missing persons in and around Prince Albert and throughout Saskatchewan. There are 128 open cases of missing persons in Saskatchewan, and some have been missing for a long time, including Michaela Bally, a young lady from Yorkton that have been missing for over 2 years. 9 empty chairs shared the stage with speakers to represent the 9 missing persons on Prince Albert Police Services active files. The names of the 9 missing persons were read out to remind us that families are still missing their loved ones and that they continue to suffer not knowing what has become of their family member. Speakers at the vigil included people from the Prince Albert Police Services, Victim Services, and the Saskatchewan Council of Women and the Prince Albert North Search and Rescue. As well, members of the Prince Albert Fire Department were in attendance. Prince Albert North Search and Rescue is a group of volunteers who are called into action when someone goes missing. They are not paid, but are all trained to a professional standard in search and rescue operations. As well, they are trained to educate the public, especially children, in what to do if they get lost or go missing. Mr. Speaker, I ask that all members join with me in thanking the Prince Albert Search and Rescue for the good work they do when someone goes missing and for organizing the vigil in Prince Albert.
I recognize the member for Regina Pasqua.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I attended the Sikh Society of Regina annual parade last Saturday, along with the Deputy Premier of Saskatchewan, Minister of Advanced Education, Minister of Sports and Culture, member from Wallashacre, member from Rochdale, and of course yourself as well, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the parade started from Gurdwara Sahib, reached in front of Legislative Building, stayed here for a couple of hours and prayed back to Gurdwara Sahib. Mr. Speaker, with the parade, we had the Sikh Motorcycle Club wearing Humboldt Bronco t-shirts to pay the tribute. Mr. Speaker, Sikhism is rooted in the teaching of equality, unity, selfless service, and social justice. Celebrations such as this parade build better understanding and help us build the maintain lasting relationship. Mr. Speaker, around Regina, the phrase Sikh values and Canadian values were displayed leading up to the event. The parade was an opportunity to come together in celebration and also educate people about the Sikh religion and values. Several activities were enjoyed by thousands in attendance, including free vegetarian food, a turban tying experience, and Gatka, which is Sikh martial arts. Thank you to all the participants, speakers, and public service members who organized the parade and events. Mr. Speaker, I ask all the members to join me congratulating the Sikh Society of Regina on another successful event. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize a member from Moose Jaw North.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, last week I, along with the Minister of Rural and Remote Health and the member from Moose Jaw-Wakima, attended the Saskatchewan Emergency Measures Service Organization's annual convention held in Moose Jaw. The conference was an opportunity for EMS providers and administrators to meet and share their passion for their field. It was also an opportunity to discuss different ways to meet the health needs of communities and of our citizens. In the aftermath of the Humboldt Bronco accident, we are reminded again of the tireless and compassionate care that our EMS teams provide this province 24/7. Mr. Speaker, it is good to see the increased awareness and attention that is being paid to the traumatic impact that responding to emergencies can have on individuals. It is assuring to know that the EMS organizations take this issue seriously and promote use of the supports that are available to the men and women who serve this province so well. Mr. Speaker, we sleep better at night knowing that the trained professionals are on duty and ready to respond to health emergencies and provide preliminary health care to our services and community. I ask everyone in this assembly to join me in congratulating the EMS providers on a successful convention, as well as thanking them for everything they do every day. We are truly grateful for each and every one of them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize a member for Cypress Hills.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to rise in the House today to acknowledge the achievement of a young constituent of mine. Taylor Kerwin is a 17-year-old hockey player from Gull Lake, and she just recently won a bronze medal for Team Canada in the Under-18 World Championship in Russia. Mr. Speaker, from an onset of the tournament, Taylor and the Team Canada knew they would be challenged. Facing crowd noise so loud the players couldn't hear their coaches or each other on the ice, they dropped the first game to Russia. Team Canada also lost to the U.S. in preliminary round. But in a typical Canadian fashion, they rallied back and made it to the semifinals. In a hard-fought semifinal game against the U.S., they fell in a shootout. Unfortunately, Taylor suffered a concussion in the quarterfinal win against the Czech Republic and was unable to participate in that game. As the team's top penalty killer, this was a significant blow. Despite her absence, Team Canada was able to defeat Russia and secure a bronze. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate Taylor and Team Canada on the bronze medal win and wish them continued success in their hockey careers. Thank you.
I recognize the member for Regina University.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Today I want to highlight a constituent of mine, Jim Demray, who for 7 years has been a beacon of light and support for our youth struggling with their mental health barriers. Jim is the president of Understand Us, which is a voluntary initiative that focuses on combating the stigma of mental health while providing education and support to our youth. Mr. Speaker, last week, to a sold-out crowd, the newest Understand Us campaign entitled Me to You was unveiled. A powerful message was delivered through a video production wherein kids express their thoughts or situations that make them feel very vulnerable, worried, or stressed. And then in response, adults who'd gone through similar experiences gave messages of hope and empowerment, letting them know they were supported and they are not alone. If only we could all have the opportunity to encourage a young person who is struggling. The video, produced by Strategy Lab, starred children from grades 7 and 8 at St. Gregory's School in Regina and has had over 13,000 views in the last 2 weeks. Mr. Speaker, Understand Us and its founder, Jim Desmarais, have been working with the good people at Strategy Lab to find creative ways to elevate this important conversation. Mr. Speaker, the world needs more of this, and we want to congratulate Understand Us for leading the way. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question period. I recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Last week, we asked the Sask Party government if they planned on fully funding the contracts for teachers who work in our kids' classrooms. It was like a trip down memory lane, Mr. Speaker. The minister wouldn't commit, and he wouldn't assure school divisions that increases in teachers' salaries would have to be made up for with cuts to the classroom. And if you thought the Sask Party government would have learned their lesson from the last time funding teachers' salaries was an issue, well, you would have been wrong. School divisions shouldn't have to go digging through the cushions to cover the increase in teachers' salaries. The government is the one who negotiates, who sets the mill rates, and who has all of the control. Why won't the Sask Party government fully commit to fully funding the new teachers' contract?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I was very clear about this last week, Mr. Speaker. There is no contract at this point in time, Mr. Speaker. We're in arbitration. We'll be having those discussions through arbitration, Mr. Speaker. And once a contract is concluded, Mr. Speaker, then we'll have a conversation on this side of the House with respect to how we're going to fund that contract, Mr. Speaker. But at this point in time, we're currently in the middle, Mr. Speaker, of going through the current year's budget, Mr. Speaker. And as I say, once that arbitrated settlement has come to pass, Mr. Speaker, then we'll have a conversation about how that's going to be funded.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, that answer simply is not good enough. The Premier and the Education Minister ran their leadership campaigns on resetting the relationship with teachers, but there's been no reset. They've shown through their actions that they have nothing more to offer than more of the same. They won't commit to fully funding teachers' contracts, and they still haven't restored the funding that they cut from last year's budget. Our educators and students deserve so much better than what they're getting from this Sask Party government. Teachers and parents know that investment in our children's education is an investment in all of our futures. When will the Sask Party government do the right thing and fully fund, commit to fully funding today those teachers' contracts?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this government has shown its commitment to public education. $7.5 million in in-year funding, Mr. Speaker. Further $30 million, the annualized part of that, Mr. Speaker, in this year's budget. Mr. Speaker, we continue to have conversations with trustees. We continue to have conversations with teachers. It's our commitment to make sure that we meet the challenges in the classroom, Mr. Speaker. And as far as resetting the relationship, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you this. I've been out talking to trustees. I've been talking to teachers, Mr. Speaker. They're pleased with the response that this government has taken with respect to funding education, Mr. Speaker. More to do, no question, Mr. Speaker, more to do. And we're going to continue to have those conversations because we know that the future of this province, Mr. Speaker, the future of our economy is dependent on making sure that we educate our children in the classroom, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to work with our partners in education, and I've been emphasizing that with whoever I speak to, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Last Thursday, a small business owner said that the Sask Party government's decision to shut down saskjobs.ca website was, quote, brutal. And that's probably the best choice of words to describe last Friday's job numbers as well. While provinces across the country saw significant job growth, Saskatchewan lost 1,800 jobs since this time last year. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan was the only province other than Newfoundland and Labrador that didn't see any job growth, and Saskatchewan was dead last. So I want to ask the minister, who has been boasting about job creation, what he has to say about 1,800 fewer jobs in this province.
Recognize the Minister of Trade.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the reality is that this economy has created 62,000 jobs over the course of the last decade, Mr. Speaker. And we have acknowledged that there are headwinds in the economy, that there are headwinds in the labour market, largely caused by the national government. We are having significant challenges getting our products to market, Mr. Speaker, whether that be through the rail transportation system, whether that be through pipelines, Mr. Speaker. There have been challenges. There are also challenges created by uncertainty with regard to a carbon tax, Mr. Speaker. Right. A carbon tax supported by the Leader of the Opposition. Yeah. And I would note as well, a carbon tax, when pushed on this matter, the critic who just asked the question said that she did not support her leader's position, Mr. Speaker. She stated this at estimates only about 2 weeks ago. So, Mr. Speaker, I would challenge her on the issue of the carbon tax. If she doesn't support her leader's position, if she doesn't stand with Justin Trudeau, does she stand with this government and stand with the people of this province?
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan has been lagging behind other provinces for months, and the minister knows that. That's right. Now our province has the highest unemployment rate outside of Atlantic Canada. 3,500 fewer jobs lost in trade, 6,400 jobs lost in scientific and technical services, and Alberta construction companies advertising for Alberta jobs in Saskatoon. Mr. Speaker, it's no wonder people are leaving our province to find opportunities elsewhere. The Sask Party government cut $3 million in job training and workforce development, and for weeks they defended their cut to the Sask Jobs website. Now we're happy to see that they reversed their short-sighted cut in the interim, but with more and more people losing their jobs, can the minister at the very least commit that he will stop making decisions that make it harder and harder for Saskatchewan people to find work?
Recognize the Minister of Trade.
Well, the member opposite cited Alberta. I would point to the fact that Alberta continues to have a higher unemployment rate than Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. Alberta also had a highly significantly larger loss of jobs over the course of the last couple of years, Mr. Speaker. And like I said, we've acknowledged that there are headwinds in the labour market. And the last thing this economy needs and the labour market needs is a massive new tax on everything, Mr. Speaker. I gave her a chance, and I hope she'll take an opportunity in her next question to respond to whether she supports her leader's position, which she said that she didn't, Mr. Speaker, on the carbon tax, or whether she stands with this government. I would also ask the member for Rosemont, for instance, who I think is generally regarded as perhaps being the most in tune with economic questions of members opposite, whether he supports his leader's position, Mr. Speaker, whether he stands with his leader in support of a carbon tax, who was very careful in his language when he was leader of the opposition with regard to a price on carbon. He never said he supported a carbon tax. So perhaps he'll get up, Mr. Speaker, and make clear whether he supports this side of the House standing for the people of this province, or whether he stands with Justin Trudeau.
As the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, last Thursday, the Justice Minister shared with the House that lawyers from the Ministry of Justice have been deployed to the GTH to help them comply with the recommendations of the Information and Privacy Commissioner. He said they were there, quote, trying to make sure that they do comply fully, that they deal with things in a proper and expeditious manner. Mr. Speaker, doing things fully and in a proper and expeditious manner means following the recommendations of the Information and Privacy Commissioner. He is an independent officer of this Assembly, and he's already reviewed all the files, and he found, quote, I find that neither GTH nor Brighton View has demonstrated to my office that there are objective grounds for believing there is a reasonable expectation of harm if the information was disclosed, end quote. When will the Sask Party government do the right thing, the easy thing, and release these documents?
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, with respect to the member opposite, we have a process and a procedure. It's prescribed in the legislation. We don't release documents. They're released by the head of the agency that they're requested from. Mr. Speaker, the members opposite know that. And we expect the documents to be gone through an appropriate vetting process to determine what is commercially sensitive, what is not, and we expect the officials at the GTH We'll work with the officials from the Privacy Commissioner and the Ministry of Justice to make sure that they're well guided in their decision. These are not decisions that anyone on this side of the House is going to make. Those are decisions that will be made there, and would encourage the members opposite to stay tuned.
As a member for John Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, despite what that minister just said, last week the minister said that when it comes to deciding what records to release, quote, the ultimate responsibility lies with government. That's the problem, Mr. Speaker. The responsibility rests with the government, but we can't rely on them to follow the law. They failed to follow the law and release the Husky Pipeline inspection records, and they've offered no assurances that they'll release all the GTH records the Commissioner has told them to. The Commissioner has read over these records, and he's decided which documents should be public and which should be withheld. People can have confidence in his office's findings. He's an independent officer, and he has nothing to hide. And when he says a record should be made public, the government should be forced to comply. Does the minister agree with me and the members on this side of the House that it's time to give the Information and Privacy Commissioner the power to order governments to release documents?
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, in the situation with Husky, the Crown Prosecutor made recommendations, made determinations. Once again, we do not interfere with the decisions that are made by the officials. Mr. Speaker, we create the legislation. We expect the legislation to be followed. We expect it to be followed carefully and appropriately. The officials at the GTH will work with the Privacy Commissioner to determine what documents are commercially sensitive and what documents aren't. Mr. Speaker, the members opposite should spend more time at the GTH. Some of them have gone on a tour. I'd encourage the rest of them to go on a tour there, see the number of jobs that are created. Another one of the employers out there is Emterra, recycling business that recycles for all of the city of Regina. They recycle all kinds of paper goods, not just leftover copies of the LEAP manifesto, but all kinds of things that end up out there, and would encourage the members out there to go and do more of a fulsome tour.
As a member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our election laws don't have any restrictions on payments from political parties to politicians. Sadly, the electoral finance system in Saskatchewan is still the Wild West. The laws are outdated and broken, and it's unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to out-of-province donations or big money, union and corporate donations, the Sask Party government seems to be content with keeping the status quo. Mr. Speaker, the legislation needs to be changed. So, will the Attorney General work with us and help change our broken and horribly out-of-date election finance laws so we can get big money out of Saskatchewan politics?
I recognize Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, the members opposite should have a look in the mirror a little bit more carefully before they start asking these kind of questions. In the last election, John Horgan and the British Columbia NDP donated $7,519.60 to the NDP, their 21st largest donation received. Wow. I don't know what idea, where did that come from? Where did they do it? I don't see them turning it down. I don't see them offering to give the money back. They also didn't oppose accepting donations from unions. Over 81,000 from UFCW Provincial Council, 54,000 from Unifor, 37,000 from United Steelworkers, $35,000 from Canada Labour Congress. Mr. Speaker, the members opposite regularly receive these donations. They make the donations, and Mr. Speaker, they should have a little bit look in the mirror, consult with themselves a bit.
And as a member for Saskatoon Centre.
Mr. Speaker, that minister just doesn't get it. He doesn't get it. Like so many issues in this province, the Sask Party government would rather stick their heads in the sand.
Hear, hear. Just looking for a little order. Recognize the member. Mr.
Speaker, over the past 10 years, the Saskatchewan Party has received $12.61 million in corporate donations, and of that, $2.87 million, let me say that again, $1 million have come from companies out of Saskatchewan. Wow. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan politics should belong to Saskatchewan people. We can do politics differently in Saskatchewan. We should be leading the country, not last, not last. To the Minister, why can't we work collaboratively? Will he support our bill, the Election Fairness and Accountability Amendment Act, and help us get big money out of Saskatchewan politics?
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, we have got Saskatchewan expatriates that are living in other provinces that still carry on business here. Mr. Speaker, we have businesses that carry on all the way across Western Canada. Mr. Speaker, all donations over $250 are publicly reported as required by the Elections Act. The opposition claims that the Sask Party is funded by a few larger, but that, Mr. Speaker, is not the case. In 2017, over 26,000 individuals donated to the Sask Party. The average donation was $65. About 1,000 corporations donated. Their average donation was $1,000 each. Mr. Speaker, it's a matter of public record. The members opposite are entitled to look at it, as we are with the union donations or the other donations that they received from John Horgan.
Recognize the member for Cumberland.
Mr. Speaker, support for mental health and addictions in the North are not adequate. Northerners were very disappointed with what came from the government's side during the 75-minute debate. Northerners face real barriers and real challenges when it comes to accessing mental health and addiction support. And those barriers are different than they are in Saskatoon and Regina. The frontline workers in northern communities are doing all they can with limited resources, but they need more. And the government should partner with the Lac La Ronge Indian Band and help them build a wellness center. When will the Sask Party government increase mental health and addiction support for the North?
Recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Mr. Speaker, as most members know, mental health and addiction support comes through the former regional health authorities now, through the Saskatchewan Health Authority, Mr. Speaker, and as I pointed out in this House before, the northern health regions, previous northern health regions in this province have enjoyed increases in the 50, 60, 70, and 80% ranges, where the rest of the province in less than 50% range, Mr. Speaker. So that shows, although we do still have issues to address in the North, it shows that we have been paying attention, Mr. Speaker. And some of those monies have gone towards things like suicide prevention protocols that have been fully implemented in northern mental health and addiction service locations. 93 staff trained in mental health first aid. 228 have received applied suicide intervention skills that gets delivered in schools. 46 have been trained in Safe Talk. The Saskatchewan Health Authority employs a community suicide prevention coordinator. Also, Northern Medical Services coordinates visiting psychiatric services, Mr. Speaker. Other organizations have been set out so that first one phone call, one contact access can be used to find all kinds of different services, Mr. Speaker. Happy to answer more, give more on record and other questions.
I got as a member for Cumberland.
Mr. Speaker, those members can pat themselves on the back all they want, but the people on the front lines and in northern communities know that the funding isn't nearly enough to meet the needs. More supports are needed, and people are dying without the mental health and addiction services they need. When will the Sask Party government stop talking about mental health and addictions and finally deliver some action?
Recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Mr. Speaker, by that member making a statement like that only discredits the hard work done by many Saskatchewan Health Authority people that are delivering top levels of service to the North, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Very disrespectful. He's very disrespectful.
4 psychiatrists in Prince Albert provide services in La Ronge, Buffalo, Narrows, Creighton, and also through telehealth. 2 child and youth psychiatrists from Saskatoon provide visiting services in the lodge with follow-up appointments through telehealth, Mr. Speaker. A child psychiatrist in Prince Albert provides services through telehealth. We have visiting services as well throughout the north on scheduled basis, Mr. Speaker. And as we have a number of times in the past, we've talked about a lot of these initiatives. Is there more work to do, Mr. Speaker? Absolutely. The members will always ridicule us for saying that, Mr. Speaker, but I think that's why we're in dire situations around this province, is because the NDP, when in power, thought that they had done enough. Mr. Speaker, we know we haven't done enough. We're going to continue to work on this file.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, there are serious gaps in mental health supports for kids around this province, and with answers like that, perhaps it's not hard to see why. Years after the tragedy in La Loche, the community is still calling for help, but they aren't the only ones. North Battleford has been grappling with their own crisis in recent months. In just the month of January, 3 young people took their lives, and tragically, 2 more youth suicides have been reported since. The community has developed an action plan in response to the rash of suicides, and they're beginning to see positive changes. Living Sky School Division is calling for help from the province to help build on the progress and to better support kids dealing with mental health concerns and the suicide crisis in their community. Has the minister reviewed their request for additional mental health resources, and can North Battleford count on this vital support?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Education.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that my Deputy Minister meets with the school division almost on a weekly basis to discuss this very issue, Mr. Speaker. And I know that there's training for teachers in that school division with respect to mental health supports has gone up, Mr. Speaker. We're having conversations on this side of the House. I've spoken to my colleagues in the Ministry of Health, Mr. Speaker, about a pilot project that we've been looking at out of the province of Alberta, Mr. Speaker, to help enhance mental health services right in the classroom, right in the schools, Mr. Speaker. We know there's more work to do, Mr. Speaker, but we have done a significant amount of work over the last number of years with respect to supporting mental health in children, Mr. Speaker. We've got over $30 million for over 400 counselors and psychologists and social workers in our education system, Mr. Speaker. 236 counselors, 70 psychologists, 78 social workers, Mr. Speaker. We support programs like the Kids Helpline, anti-bullying resources, and mental health first aid training, Mr. Speaker. And just 2 weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, had a conversation with some individuals out of Alberta to look for to help us enhance those various resources in our classrooms, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to work on this, Mr. Speaker. We know it's very important.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, more ministers getting up and reading lists instead of actually listening to the people in the communities and understanding what is going on. The minister knows full well that the Living Sky School Division had to implement deep cuts following this government's $54 million funding reduction in last year's budget. They cut dozens of teachers, EAs, and support positions to deal with a $6 million shortfall. But it's not done. This year, the same school division is receiving $650,000 less than they did last year. The community is doing their best to address this issue, and the school division is saying that they need extra support. This government claims that it wants to do better for kids grappling with mental illness. Well, Mr. Speaker, here's an opportunity, one that has the potential to save lives. Will this government be funding additional mental health resources for kids in North Battleford in this time of need?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned in my first answer, Mr. Speaker, my Deputy Minister is in contact with the school division on an almost weekly basis, Mr. Speaker. I can also tell the member opposite that Kevin Cameron, who is the trauma expert that was on the ground in La Loche, Mr. Speaker, has been contracted by the North Battleford School Division, Mr. Speaker, and we funded that support, Mr. Speaker. So it's another example of the supports that we're providing to make sure that our children are not just getting a proper education in the classroom, Mr. Speaker, but are safe and have the resources that they need to deal with the challenges that they face as young people, Mr. Speaker. As I've said, Mr. Speaker, there's always more work to do. We're committed to doing that work. I think some of the things that we've done, especially in the Northern Lights School Division, Mr. Speaker, and this particular school division is a great example of the commitment that this government's making.
As the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan has the second highest per capita rate of reported sexual violence in the country. And we know this isn't the full picture. Sexual assaults remain the most underreported violent crime in Canada, with as little as 5% of incidents being reported to police. For survivors living in rural and remote areas, and for those who are Indigenous, the likelihood of gender-based violence is even higher. This isn't a new issue for our province, but it is one that is getting worse, while Saskatchewan remains the only province without a provincial sexual assault strategy. When can we expect a provincial strategy, and what is the government's plan to better support the essential work being done on the front lines in the meantime?
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I certainly agree the member opposite has raised a concern that not only can but should affect everybody in this province. Everybody in this province should take the issue seriously and want to offer the supports and to do the things that are necessary and right. We have a report coming down in the next few days, but Mr. Speaker, I can tell the House some of the things that have happened already. We've passed legislation this last year to allow for the breaking of a residential lease. We've also arranged to allow for 10 unpaid days for victims in violence and families to access services. We're doing consultation now on Clare's Law so that police can disclose potentially dangerous information about previous violent or abusive behavior. We have got the Listen project underway so that a survivor of sexual violence can receive up to 2 hours of free legal advice going on for a period of 4 years, Mr. Speaker. And those are the supports that we're going to continue, and we will have more to say in the future.
Thank you. Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Orders of the day.
The Honourable Mr. Duncan.
Stand.
Government orders, adjourned debates. Item number 1, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 114, the Vehicles for Hire Act. Ms. Mullet.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my pleasure today to rise and enter into second reading debates on Bill number 114, the Vehicle for Hire Act, Mr. Speaker. This is a bill that was introduced with a certain amount of fanfare. Certainly is an issue that other jurisdictions have dealt with before. We have here in Saskatchewan, and essentially deals with the rideshare companies. Some of the commercial names being Uber and Lyft that we have seen in other jurisdictions. Mr. Speaker, numerous of my colleagues have had opportunity to enter into debate on this bill, and I do welcome the opportunity to add my thoughts before this bill goes into committee. One of the things that I want to touch upon is some of the claims that have been made, or assertions that have been made with regard to this bill. You know, important issues like drinking and driving, and the impact that this may or may not have on what really are epidemic rates of drinking and driving in this province. And certainly members on this side welcome measures that have an impact at reducing those rates of drinking and driving. But we also really think it's important that we look at best practices and evidence with regard to measures that are impactful, that do have the effect of actually reducing rates of drinking and driving. And that's a question that we have had and continue to have in terms of where this has been shown, rideshare technology, where it's been shown to reduce rates of drinking and driving. And then, of course, the geography and distribution of population in Saskatchewan is a little bit unique in that we have so many kilometers of roads, such distance between communities, and such a relatively disperse population across again, a very, very large landmass. So those are some questions that we continue to have. More recently, there's been an assertion that this bill will help with providing transportation that has been lost with the loss of STC. That's a relatively bold assertion and one that I think before last week we hadn't heard, but we'd be very curious to see if there's evidence to that effect. I know there have been previous assertions that the private sector would move in and would ensure that all of those who lost service and lost the opportunity, the ability to get around the province when SDC was wound down, that the private sector would step in. And what we've seen instead, Mr. Speaker, is a lot of, some routes are there, but there's been a lot of uncertainty and certainly a lot of gaps around the province. So we'd be interested to hear what evidence there is and why those assertions are being made. Certainly no one is saying no to ride sharing. I know that various jurisdictions as well, various taxi companies have embraced the app for hailing cars. One big concern here is the lack of, or apparent lack of, input from the existing taxi cab industry in the province, and what this bill might have in terms of impact on that industry. We certainly have heard those concerns, but we're also hearing that those groups don't feel particularly well heard by the government. So we would like to raise some of those concerns. And then another issue is just around safety for all those who work in this industry, be it rideshare or within the existing taxi industry. The risk that those people expose themselves to. How do we make sure that we get that right, so that we're not having, in a few months or another year, hearing a horrible accident, a horrible situation like we've heard in the last 2 previous years with regards to taxi drivers. And I think this represents a big change, and is not. Is taken out of context with looking at a complete overhaul of the way that the taxi industry is treated, and bringing ride sharing as part of that. I know that that's been a question that has been raised by a number of people, that maybe we're missing opportunities to look at a suite of different legislation at the same time to ensure that we're modernizing transportation in the province as more of a whole rather than piecemeal, and certainly along our own timeline in this province rather than perhaps timelines of other interests. But I know that we will have opportunity to speak to this bill in committee, and I look forward to touching back in with a number of the stakeholders. I know the municipalities have a big role to play should this bill be passed, and in creating their own licensing and bylaws for this industry, and I think that their voice is important here as well. Again, Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to get some of those questions and concerns on the record ahead of committee. But with that, I am prepared to move the bill to committee.
Assembly ready for the question? The question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 114, the Vehicles for Hire Act, you now read a second time. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? It's the Government House Leader.
I designate that Bill number 114, the Vehicles for Hire Act, be committed to the Standing Committee of Crown and Central Agencies.
Here.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies. Recognize Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So that the committees may continue their good work today, I move that this House do now adjourn.
The Government House Leader has moved to adjourn for committees. Is it pleasure to send me to adopt the motion? Carried. This committee stands adjourned until, this House stands adjourned until tomorrow at 1:30.